Hi everyone. In this video, let's try to understand the Azure VM concepts called encryption. So Azure Virtual Machine, when we are trying to provision, we will be seeing an encryption in place. And what is the use of an encryption and why it is so important is what we'll look at. So when we are trying to access the application as an end user, either anything, whether we whatever we are trying to access a virtual machine, whichever workload it is trying to run, end of the day, that data, whatever the application is trying to read and everything, is happening from the virtual disks. See, the virtual disks could be of for a virtual machine, which we usually see is one is OS disk and one is temporary disk, and the other ones are data disks. In reality, even these are the disks which can be linked to a virtual machine, but actually this is a physical storage. End of the day, this all disks are stored in one physical storage option. And yes, you're seeing that as a virtual disk, but end of the day, they have one specific uh, disk where this entire virtual disk could be data could be residing in that physical storage. Now, what is the need of encryption here? And that's where we look at why it is so important and everything. So when we try to get into encryption, there are four types of encryptions which we can see for a virtual machine. One is server-side encryption, one is Azure disk encryption, and encryption at host, and we also see a confidential encryption. We look at each of these encryptions in detail in this video, but before that, let's understand the need of the encryption in this. So for the major thing is it maintains the trust of the organization, because organizations will have whoever are trying to use Azure as a cloud as their service in terms of storing the data or hosting the applications and everything. Or Azure has been considered as a trusted one because the data which they are storing is been encrypted, and it has not will not have any data breach or data leakage and all that. So we are seeing right now that around the clock there will be a data protection when you are using the cloud encryption, and it's whatever the insider threats we are actually seeing will be all mitigated when we are using cloud encryption. And the obviously when you are having an encrypted data in cloud, it is maintaining the organization's data with integrity and everything. So ensures in protecting multiple device when we are accessing the data from multiple devices and everything. And the next point, when we are trying to use the cloud encryption, we are meeting most of the compliances which we have as an organization when we are trying to take customers' data or anything. When you're trying to provide service, we have to follow certain compliances, and using the cloud encryption, which meets the compliance requirements. So let's understand what is the server-side encryption here. And so when we look at that the data which a virtual machine is trying to take from the virtual disks, where does the server-side encryption comes in? So what the server-side encryption talks about is server-side encryption. There are three key points. One is you can use PMK keys to encrypt do a server-side encryption, or you can use CMK customer managed, or you can use the both do a double encryption. Now, what is server-side? Inside the machine, the server, when the data is being stored in the physical storage, the virtual machine will use this keys and will encrypt the data. So right now we have a data which is there, which is ABC. Let's assume this is the data, and using the encryption keys, either the PMK or CMK, or doing the double encryption, they will encrypt the data and make it like a make it another message. So when we encrypt the data, so assume that it was like uh, DEF. Now, this data, when it is being stored in the physical storage, that is when that becomes a server-side encryption. So whatever data which is actually being stored in the physical storage is actually being encrypted, and then it is stored in the main physical storage. That comes as server-side encryption. Now there are types of server-side encryptions. That is what one is PMK and one is CMK. What is PMK? Platform managed keys. So using the PMK keys, which is platform managed keys, means the encryption keys which is used to encrypt the data, that will be there with Azure. And if at all it's the customer managed keys, then the encryption keys are managed and maintained by us. So if we are trying to use CMK as an encryption option in server side, then we actually use when we are the people who are maintaining and managing rotation of the keys and usage of keys. And if we are using double encryption, that means that the platform using the PMK and CMK will encrypt the data, and that will be end of the day stored in the physical storage device. So that's how the server-side encryption works. Now the next one is Azure disk encryption. So when we are trying to prefer Azure disk encryption, how does Azure disk encryption work? So you are trying to create disks, manage disks and everything. You can use the AD, Azure disk encryption. So you will create encryption keys in key vault. This is a key vault. Azure Key Vault. Azure Key Vault has is a secret management solution where you can store secrets, keys, encryption keys, and certificates. Now, in this, we'll create encryption keys, and we'll use that encryption keys to encrypt the Azure disks, and that is called Azure Disk Encryption. So how will the when virtual machine is trying to when you enable the Azure Disk Encryption, when the virtual machine is trying to access the OS disk or the data disks and everything, it first has to retrieve the uh, key vault encryption keys from the key vault. This is the symbol for key vault. It receives it takes the keys from the key vault and then access the data and since it shows to us. So similarly, the read and write operations. So it's just not a read and write read operation. So it's even the write operations or everything will be happening everything from this description. So this is one type of encryption. Then there is another encryption type which is called encryption at host. What is the importance of an encryption at host? Uh, so we are only seeing that the data which is uh, seen in the virtual machine. End of the day, it was when it was been encrypted, it was encrypted till the host level. But uh, so at when I say host, the physical storage level. So before it is stored at the physical storage level, it is already the data which is encrypted and it is being stored. But what if the physical storage also, if you wanted that to be encrypted, what do you have to do? So you have to enable encryption at host. Okay, see, because when you the data which is being stored in the VMs, the from the taking the virtual disks, and end of the day, virtual disks are actually taken from a physical storage, but the data which is being taken from a server-side encryption, it is actually being encrypted and then stored in the physical disk. Doesn't mean that the physical disk, which that storage option, which is Azure is actually keeping behind the scenes, that is encrypted or not encrypted is not an solution. But right now Azure is offering that new feature called encryption at host, and where even that physical device, the storage device, is also encrypted. If you enable this option, that is when just not the storage that the whatever the data you are sending is not only just encrypted, but also the entire disk with the physical storage disk is also been encrypted. So let's see how we'll be able to and see this options called server-side encryption, Azure disk encryption, encryption at host. So we have another one which is confidential encryption. So this is used for confidential VMs. So there are specific family sizes which we use confidential VMs and everything. So that is E size, D size of specific family size and E size of specific things. Use confidential VMs. So let's not get into this at this point of time. Let's understand more about server-side encryption and disk-side encryption and encryption at host. So in the further labs where we'll be seeing how do we set up a server-side encryption and disk-side encryption and encryption nodes. So keep it summarized. Server-side encryption means that a virtual machine, when it is trying to, it will have the OS disks and temp disks and data disks, all this. But inside the server, it will encrypt the data, and then which the disks wherever it is actually being stored in a physical storage solution of Azure, in that this data will be encrypted, and then it will be stored in this location, physical storage location of Azure. That is server side. So in server side, there are three types of encryptions. One is when you're trying to encrypt the data, you can use PMK, which is platform managed keys. Means Azure will manage the encryption keys, and using those encryption keys, you will encrypt the data and then store. Otherwise, you will encrypt the keys using CMK, which is you will manage your own keys, you will bring your own keys, and using that you will encrypt the data. The server will encrypt the data and it will store it in the physical disk of physical storage location of Azure. Otherwise, we can use double encryption. Using these both keys, they'll achieve one encryption, which is called double encryption, and they'll encrypt the data and then store in the physical location. That's a server-side encryption. Now, similarly, when we talk about Azure disk encryption, we take a disk, we take a key vault, we create encryption keys in that, or we store the encryption keys in it, and those encryption keys will be used to encrypt the Azure virtual disk. So it's in fact the same, but the way you implement Azure disk encryption and server-side encryption are bit different. That's it. But then the usage would also be the same factor. You're encrypting the data using Azure disk encryption, and the way it works is for a virtual machines, Linux machines, there will be a decrypt software which will be utilized by the Azure Disk Encryption Service while they are trying to encrypt for Azure Linux machines. For Windows machines, they use BitLocker, and they encrypt that data for the Windows virtual machines. Now, encryption at host. What does encryption at host means? Uh, Even the physical, so the data at the end of the day, when we talk about SSE, it is actually being encrypted and stored in a physical location, but we also wanted that physical location to be also encrypted entirely, and that is where we see the option called encryption at host. So thank you guys. So let's see in the further videos how do we do this labs and everything. Thank you.